Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qiju. Coming up in this edition, Ukraine has agreed to a limited ceasefire on energy infrastructure following a phone call between the presidents of Ukraine and the United States. Hamas says Israel's ground operations violate the terms of the ceasefire, but the Israeli Prime Minister has justified the offensive. And the US Federal Reserve is warning of slower growth and higher inflation due to policy turmoil over President Trump's import tariffs. We begin in Europe. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says a halt to strikes on energy infrastructure in its conflict with Russia could be done quickly. Zelensky made the remarks after a phone conversation with the US President Donald Trump, the first call since their Oval Office clash weeks ago. The talk comes a day after Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke to Trump and agreed to pause strikes on Ukrainian energy sites. The White House says Trump also discussed Ukraine's electricity supply and nuclear power plants. He said American ownership of these plants would be the best protection and support. Nathan King has details from Washington.
President Trump made an offer for the US to own Ukraine's power grid, including nuclear power, we understand. Now, that would be unworkable, according to Ukrainian officials, but you can still see, even in the absence of this signed minerals deal, that the vast resources of Ukraine very much on the mind of the American president. Let's listen to part of the official readout from the foreign policy team of this White House after the Zelensky call.
President Trump fully briefed President Zelensky on his conversation with Putin and the key issues discussed. They reviewed the situation in Kursk and agreed to share information closely between their defense staffs as the battlefield situation evolved. President Zelensky asked for additional air defense systems to protect his civilians, particularly Patriot missile systems, and President Trump agreed to work with him to find what was available, particularly in Europe.
Now, of course, we don't have a full ceasefire yet. That will be negotiated, hopefully, in the coming days in Saudi Arabia. Rhetorically, Trump had said he wanted to end the war on day one while campaigning. Well, the whisper around the State Department here and elsewhere in Washington is they'd like to get a ceasefire done by 100 days. Russia, remember, wants Ukraine not to have access to Western weapons, US and European, in the advent of any ceasefire. No swapping out of its forces, refreshing its men, etc. Europe would find it very difficult to go along. It's even ramping up plans to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on defense as they sense that this White House may pull back from commitments made by previous administrations. So it's not just about Ukraine, it's not just about the US-Russian relationship, it's also the US relationship with Europe after 80 years nearly of the NATO alliance.
That was Nathan King on a first call between Trump and Zelensky following their heated exchange at the White House weeks ago. Moving on to the Middle East, the Israeli military has resumed ground operations in central and southern Gaza. Hamas condemned the move as a new and dangerous violation of the 2-month ceasefire. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has defended the renewed airstrikes, stating that ceasefire negotiations would continue only under fire. Jonathan Regev reports from Tel Aviv.
Reports have emerged that some kind of a ground operation has also begun in Gaza, meaning that ground forces have begun going back into the Gaza Strip, the Netzarim corridor, which we have learned to speak about in the past. They're now again partly in the hands of the IDF. Israeli forces have entered through the Netzarim corridor about halfway. It means that for the moment the Gaza Strip is not yet cut between north and south as it was in the past, but it clearly seems to be the way. The Israeli officials said that the operation will escalate with time. More and more elements will be included with a massive bombardment from the air and artillery. Now we're speaking of some kind of a beginning of a ground offensive. We're also hearing that the infantry Golani brigade on high alert, also with the possibility of going into Gaza, meaning the next element being a ground operation now seems to be practically underway. And more than anyone, hostage families are extremely worried as to what will happen with their loved ones now. We've heard from the hostages who recently came back from Gaza that every time that there was a military escalation, they were the first ones to suffer from beatings, from hunger, from thirst. And also, some of them may have also been killed or injured by the Israeli operations, and therefore a lot of concern among hostage families. They're saying time and time again that it has already been proven that the best way to bring the hostages back is through negotiations, through an agreement, not through military pressure.
That was Jonathan Regev reporting from Tel Aviv. Meanwhile, the United Nations has warned that the renewed attacks on the ongoing aid blockade are further worsening the already dire humanitarian crisis in the Palestinian enclave. Nadra Al-Tibi has more.
Israeli airstrikes and ongoing restrictions on the entry of aid have led to widespread shortages of food and crucial medical supplies in Gaza. With the collapse of the ceasefire and the renewed escalation of Israeli airstrikes, Palestinians in Gaza have rushed to buy and stockpile essential supplies. Gazans whose homes were destroyed in the war and who were forced to seek shelter are barely able to provide for themselves, relying primarily on food aid, which has already been halted with the closure of the crossing.
We are afraid of famine and its impact on our children and the sick. I don't know how I will be able to provide food for them since we don't have any money. My sons are all unemployed and we really can't manage our affairs.
Gaza Strip markets suffered devastating losses due to the war, which caused most shops to close and led to severe shortages of basic food items. The UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs warned on Tuesday that the aid crisis in Gaza is worsening as Israeli resumed airstrikes across the territory and continued to block vital supplies.
As Israeli attacks on Gaza escalate and aid workers are unable to do their jobs, Palestinian civilians are facing catastrophic conditions, forced to face hunger and repeated displacement under relentless Israeli bombardment.
That was Nadra Al-Tibi reporting. Finally, in North America, the U.S. Federal Reserve has warned of slower growth and higher inflation in the economy due to policy turmoil over President Trump's import tariffs. Fed Chairman Jeremy Powell said they would wait for more clarity on Trump's policies. Owen Fairclough has details.
The US central bank holding its benchmark interest rate at around 4.5% is no surprise and entirely in line with forecasts. The Federal Reserve had planned to cut that rate that influences the cost of borrowing potentially twice this year, so there's still plenty of time to do that. But it's the Fed's revised forecasts that reflect increasing uncertainty about the US economy and its direction, and specifically the impact of Donald Trump's trade war. On Wednesday, the Fed revised its forecast for three critical areas of the economy: economic growth down, and both inflation and unemployment up. And while none of them represent dramatic revisions, they do chime with fears that President Trump's tariffs on major trade partners, supposedly to protect the economy and jobs, are backfiring. And these concerns are leading some economists to resurrect the term stagflation. Trump's tariffs and the impact on prices are raising concerns that inflation will rise as economic growth declines or flatlines. Put them together and you have stagflation. And in another measure of how quickly all of this ripples out across the world, on Tuesday, ratings agency Fitch lowered its global growth forecast for 2024. And all of that puts the focus on the International Monetary Fund when it hosts its spring meetings here next month. In January, it optimistically revised US growth for 2024 upwards.
That was Owen Fairclough on the US Fed's decision to keep interest rates unchanged amid growing uncertainty around the Trump administration. Meanwhile, President Trump has expressed discontent with the Fed's move, saying it would be much better off cutting rates as US tariffs are already transitioning their way into the economy. Several U.S. trading partners have imposed reciprocal tariffs on American agricultural products, including California almonds. The state's agriculture market is the largest in the nation, generating nearly $60 billion a year in revenue. 40% of the crops are exported to international markets. It is Tian Shan explores how the tariffs have affected almond growers in the Sunshine State.
Almond growers in California have long had to deal with a number of uncertainties, including climate and water, and the recent imposition of global tariffs is only adding to the instability.
In the previous round of Trump tariffs, one of our biggest markets at the time was China, and China retaliated with a 50% tariff. And that's had consequences for California almonds that have cost the farmers hundreds of millions of dollars. And it was still in effect, even when some of these new tariffs were announced.
Last year, California exported 37% less almonds to China compared to 2018, when China was the top market for California almonds before the first round of tariffs. The European Union has also retaliated with its own tariffs on California almonds. Its imports had reached $1.2 billion last year, making up over a third of California's almond exports. But almond growers here are now worried that they could also lose customers in Europe. It comes at a time when the market price for almonds have gone down, while its production costs have risen. Some businesses remain confident. California produces nearly 80% of the world's supply of almonds, but nearly 70% of those crops are slated for export.
To be fair, obviously we would prefer not to have them because, we're better off if our customers are doing well and making money. And so in the long run, it's not helpful for us. In the short term, it's much more of a burden on the customer than it is on California.
Tariffs cause supply chains to find alternative trade routes, but experts warn that it impacts buyers and sellers alike.
Basically, two things happened in China. They pivoted towards Australia, and Australia ramped up its production, and they also expanded domestic supplies. So California has lost significant market share in China. So that's another lesson, is that tariffs have a long-term impact. If a foreign buyer is subjected to a trade war, they might look elsewhere for supplies and they wouldn't necessarily come back.
And given the uncertainty of returns on their investment, some growers are questioning the feasibility of a long-term commitment to growing almonds.
That was Edith Tianshan speaking with Business Insiders on how trade tensions around the world have impacted the agricultural industry in the US. Now, recapping the headlines before we go. Ukraine has agreed to a limited ceasefire on energy infrastructure following a phone call between the presidents of Ukraine and the US. Hamas says Israel's ground operations violate the terms of the ceasefire, but the Israeli Prime Minister has justified the offensive. And the US Federal Reserve is warning of slower growth and higher inflation due to policy turmoil over President Trump's import tariffs. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.